Hi Hires, we are looking at Sustainability and Interdependence Unit and the components of biodiversity. When we talk about biodiversity, we are looking at the living variety, the differences that we see amongst a living system. And we can see different levels of this. So we start off with the ecosystem diversity. So how many different habitats are we finding and systems that are self-sustaining and organised within that. And then within each ecosystem, we can look at the species. So how many different species do you have? And then within each species, we can see, okay, what's the diversity within that? So the variation that we find within the individuals of the species. And we can think of that as a kind of nested system. In ecosystem, really we're just looking at, in a particular area, how many distinct ecosystems can we find? Within species diversity, we can even split it into two parts. So we can say, how many different species do we have? And the greater the number of that, the more rich we would say the ecosystem is, so that's species richness. And then we can say, what's the proportion of each species in the ecosystem? So the relative abundance of each particular species. Just a little revision of the impact of grazing. So if you remember, species diversity is linked to grazing intensity, but not in a straight line as you might expect. It's actually a curve. At low grazing intensity, you actually get a low species diversity, and that is a little bit against what you might expect or think would happen. But that's because the most aggressive species just take over. Nothing else gets a look in. At the top end, with high grazing intensity, that makes sense. Only the really most robust species are going to survive. Just about everything else just gets eaten. But what you have is a kind of best case. With moderate grazing, the most aggressive ones are held in check, so they don't take over, but you don't wipe out everything. So you get a high species diversity with a moderate grazing intensity. Okay, there are several different ways that species can interact and determine abundance of other species diversity. Keystone has already been mentioned, but there's also this term dominant. Now what I mean by dominant is that one species has taken over. So we've now got a really high abundance of a particular species, which is decreasing the richness of the environment. And what's happening there is that that species is taking almost every resource that's in the ecosystem and preventing anyone else from getting it. Okay, and what that also means is that you get a decrease in the niches available. So what you have here is a diagram showing biomass and the impact. So dominant species have a high biomass and a high impact. That means they've taken over. But keystone species can actually have a low biomass but have a really high impact on it. So some of these are specific examples that we'll look at a little bit further on. This is what we mean about having a particular keystone. So these are kelp forests off the coast in California, and with sea otters you get quite a lot of them, but without them you don't get very many at all, because what you have are these organisms down here which are feeding on basically the bases of the kelp and therefore not being able to withstand it. If you have sea otters, they're going down, taking these out, keeping them under control, and therefore preventing the sea kelp from being decimated. Another really clear experiment that was done was with starfish, and what they discovered is that they again were holding in check particularly aggressive species that otherwise would just take over. So when you didn't have the starfish, you get this drop of species diversity. With them, remains high. Genetic diversity is going to be how many different alleles do you have, and then how many of the different alleles you have in which frequency. Okay, so it's a kind of complex system that you have to plug all that information into. But we can look at the number of loci with more than one allele. So you look to see how many different genes you have with differences inside them. You can look at just one particular gene and say, okay, how many different alleles do you have for that in that particular gene? Or you can look again at a particular gene and say, right, okay, how many of them are heterozygous? So that might be with several different alleles, but the important thing is you're just looking for how common is heterozygosity. Okay, so there are lots of things that will impact on genetic diversity. A couple of these are no longer in the course content. Genetic drift is no longer in it. Mutation you do need to know, and obviously that's going to increase the number of alleles. Gene flow, so the movement of individuals' genetics. And natural selection will obviously impact because that is the non-random increase or decrease in a particular allele. A really important take home from this is to think about how diversity impacts on how stable and how robust an ecosystem is. Basically, the more links you have within an ecosystem, so the more connections that you have, the more impacts you have from individuals to other individuals, species within this, the more likely it is to survive if you take out one of those species. If, however, you don't have a large number of interconnections and a large number of species, complex food webs, then taking out one is likely to destroy that entire ecosystem. And within a population even, you can see that the more variation you have, the more chance there is, if something does change, that you have individuals which can live through that change and therefore more likely to survive as an ecosystem set. And that's us for looking at biodiversity.